And then a light bulb went on above my head, just like in cartoons when a character gets an idea or an answer to a question. Heck, my third child wasn't really mine. She was another man's biological daughter. I was on the phone with a genealogygurus.com representative trying to figure out why my daughter's DNA test had not been processed after 10 weeks. I had given her the test as an extra Christmas gift, and now I was giving the representative the appropriate numbers so they could track it down. After about a 5-minute wait, he came back on the line and assured me that the test had been processed. However, he explained that this was a confidentiality issue between the company and the person who actually took the test, so he could not provide me with any additional information. But if you processed it, why doesn't it show up on my DNA evidence? I asked, my voice tinged with excitement and frustration. Sir, there are several reasons why your daughter may not show up on your DNA evidence, but I am not at liberty to discuss this particular test with you, he replied in a somewhat irritated tone. And that's when the light bulb went off. Obviously, the number one reason she doesn't show up in my matches is because she doesn't fit. I ended the call in a daze. I remember hitting the red end call button, and then I started crying. I woke up a few minutes later, curled up on the couch in the family room. I still had 15 minutes left before my lunch break, so I called my daughter, who was probably on her lunch break too, since she worked in the same time zone as me. I knew she usually ate lunch curled up with a book at her desk, so I wasn't worried about disturbing her. She picked up the phone on the first ring. "Hi, Daddy, how are you?" she said somewhat warily. "Pumpkin, you know I love you and trust you completely, but I know what's going on with the DNA test," I bluffed. I called Genealogy Gurus and was told it was processed about 2 weeks ago. There was the sound of air being sucked in from her side, and then silence for a few moments. "Daddy, I don't know what to say," she finally whispered, her voice trembling. "It's okay, sweetie," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just need you to be honest with me." There was another long pause. "Mom told me not to tell you," she confessed, her voice breaking. "She said it would ruin everything." I felt a lump forming in my throat, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Pumpkin, nothing you say will ever make me stop loving you. I just want the truth." She took a deep breath. "The test showed that you're not my biological father," she said quietly. "Mom said it was a mistake, that she made a mistake before you two were married, but she begged me not to tell you." My heart ached at her words, but I also felt a strange sense of relief. At least now I knew the truth. "Thank you for telling me, sweetheart," I said softly. "It means a lot to me." "I'm so sorry, Daddy," she sobbed. "I didn't want to hurt you." "You haven't hurt me," I assured her. "You've only given me the truth, and that's all I ever wanted. We'll get through this together, okay?" She sniffled. "Okay, Daddy." After we hung up, I sat there for a long time, letting the reality of the situation sink in. Holly's betrayal ran deeper than I had ever imagined, but I also felt a renewed sense of determination. My daughter's love and trust in me were unshaken, and that gave me the strength I needed to move forward. With a deep breath, I resolved to continue building my new life, one based on honesty and real connections. Holly's lies had no place in this new chapter. As I got up from the couch and headed back to work, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The past was behind me, and a future of authenticity and genuine relationships lay ahead. At least 10 seconds of silence passed. "I know, Dad, we need to talk, but I can't do it here and now. Call me tonight, and don't be in the room with Mom when you call." I was a blur as I drove back to the office, my mind racing with questions and emotions. My afternoon at the engineering firm where I worked was anything but productive. There were so many things swirling around in my head, so many questions, and the heartbreaking thought that my little girl might not actually be my biological daughter. Being analytical by nature, I knew I had to prioritize and tackle these problems one at a time. I was the VP of engineering at Sikafus Electronics for a reason, and at this point, I knew that the best thing for me to do was to treat my personal problems like project problems and address them in an orderly fashion. The old man, Dwayne Sikafus, had taught me that himself when he hired me straight out of Purdue University to work for his then-fledgling company. With Dwayne at the helm and me never far from his right hand, Sikafus grew into an industry leader and we both made significant profits. I made great money, had great benefits, and worked with wonderful, witty people. This was the environment that had always provided me with stability and a sense of control. Now more than ever, I needed to rely on that same sense of order and logic to navigate this personal crisis. Back in my office, I tried to focus on work, but found it nearly impossible. My thoughts kept drifting back to the conversation with my daughter and the bombshell revelation about her DNA test. I knew I had to keep my emotions in check until I had all the facts. As evening approached, I decided to leave work early. I needed to prepare myself mentally for the conversation ahead. Driving home, I felt a mixture of dread and determination. I knew this talk could change everything, but I also knew it was necessary. Once home, I made myself a cup of tea and sat in the quiet of my living room, gathering my thoughts. When the clock struck 8, I dialed my daughter's number. She picked up on the first ring. "Hi, Daddy," she said, her voice soft and cautious. "Pumpkin, it's time we talked," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I know, I've been so scared to tell you. I didn't want to hurt you," she confessed. "I understand, sweetheart, but honesty is the most important thing right now. We need to be open with each other." She took a deep breath. "The test showed that you're not my biological father. Mom said it was a mistake, that she made a mistake before you two were married. She begged me not to tell you." The pain in her voice was palpable, and my heart ached for her. "Pumpkin, nothing you say will ever make me stop loving you. You've always been my daughter, and that will never change." There was a long pause, and I could hear her sniffling on the other end. "Thank you, Daddy. I was so afraid of losing you. You haven't lost me, and you never will. We'll get through this together, okay?" "Okay, Daddy," she whispered, her voice full of relief. After we hung up, I felt a strange sense of peace. The truth was painful, but it was also liberating. I knew there were still many challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long while, I felt ready to face them. As I sat back and reflected on the day, I realized how much I valued the honesty and trust I had with my daughter. Holly's betrayal had created a rift, but it had also brought me closer to the people who truly mattered. With a renewed sense of determination, I decided to continue building my new life, one based on authenticity and genuine relationships. Holly's lies had no place in this new chapter. The past was behind me, and a future of honesty and real connections lay ahead. And when I came home in the evening, there was a beautiful, sexy wife and 3 wonderful children waiting for me. Eventually, the kids grew up, left home, got married, and had children of their own. It was a little lonely in the house at first, but we found lots of things to do, and I think the loneliness revitalized us as a couple again. But as I thought back over the last month of my life, I noticed a few small incidents, including Marissa's phone call to my wife about 2 weeks ago. On Tuesday night, we were both sitting in the family room watching TV when Kaylee's phone rang. She looked at it and said it was Marissa, and then answered it. The conversation went on for about 5 minutes. Kaylee answered with almost only yes and no, and I could see tears welling up in the corners of her eyes. When she hung up, I asked if everything was okay, and she said Marissa's cat had some health problems. "No big deal," she said, though I noticed she was a little nervous around me. I thought it was a little strange that she was taking Marissa's cat's health so personally. That must have been when Marissa found out about it. Kaylee didn't know I sent Marissa the test. I didn't think it was noteworthy. Marissa was the only one of the 3 kids who had any interest in genealogy, so I bought a kit online and sent it to her. I've been researching my family roots for years on end, and I really liked the DNA test part. I thought Marissa would take the test with gusto. Obviously, I was wrong. When I got home, I tried my best not to act any differently with Kaylee, even though I was seething inside. "Work on one problem at a time, I repeated to myself. I met Kaylee at Purdue my sophomore year. We didn't get together until my senior year, but we've been inseparable ever since, or so it seemed to me. We married a year after graduating from college 31 years ago, and to this day, I would tell anyone that it was the best decision of my life. She is still beautiful at 54, and despite having 3 children, she exercises regularly and has the body of a woman in her 30s. She's fun and funny, and until today, I looked forward to spending the rest of my life with her. Around 8, I told Kaylee that I needed to call the old man about a project we were working on and left the room. I actually took my jacket and went outside to the porch swing so I could talk without fear of Kaylee hearing, and then I called Marissa. Marissa answered on the first ring, and her voice was completely distraught. "I'm sorry, Dad. I know I should have told you sooner, but Mom asked that I not say anything until she had a chance to talk to you," she whispered, before I could even say hello. "I'm not mad at you. Calm down," I said as soothingly as I could. "I'm not accusing you of anything. You're just as much a victim as I am." I could hear her breathing heavily on the phone. I knew it was killing her. "Reese, I want you to know that this doesn't change anything between us. I'm still your father, and you're still my pumpkin. I've always given you kids all my love, and after all this time, I'm not going to stop now unless you want me to stop." Her voice broke as she replied, "No, Dad, I need you. I just didn't know how to handle it. Mom said it would ruin everything. It's okay, sweetheart. We're going to get through this, but we need to talk to Mom together. We need to face this as a family." We agreed to talk the next evening, and I ended the call with a heavy heart. I sat on the porch swing, staring into the darkening sky, trying to make sense of everything. The life I thought I knew had been shattered, but I also felt a strange sense of clarity. I knew what needed to be done. The next day was a blur of work and anxious anticipation. As evening approached, I prepared myself for the confrontation. Kaylee and I sat down in the living room, and I called Marissa, putting her on speakerphone. Kaylee looked confused at first, but as Marissa started to speak, her expression changed to one of guilt and fear. "Mom, Dad knows about the DNA test," Marissa began, her voice trembling. "He knows he's not my biological father." Kaylee's face went pale. "I can explain," she stammered. "Explain? You lied to me for over 20 years, I said, my voice rising. "Why, Kaylee? Why didn't you tell me the truth?" Tears streamed down her face as she struggled to find the words. "I was scared. I thought I'd lose you. I thought you'd leave us if you knew." "You should have trusted me," I said, my voice softening. "We could have worked through this together, but now you've broken that trust." Marissa's voice came through the speaker, filled with anguish. "Mom, how could you do this to Dad, to all of us?" Kaylee sobbed openly. "I know I made a terrible mistake. I know I hurt you all. But I love you, Alex. I love our family. Please, we can get through this." I looked at Kaylee, the woman I had loved for over 3 decades, and saw the fear and regret in her eyes. "I don't know, Kaylee. This changes everything. We need time to figure this out." The room was filled with a heavy silence, broken only by the sound of Kaylee's sobs and Marissa's soft cries through the phone. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same again. As I sat there, I realized that my love for my children would never waver, and my commitment to them remained steadfast. The future was uncertain, but with honesty and courage, we would face it together. At this point, she fell apart and sobbed almost incoherently into the phone. "I love you, Daddy. I don't need anyone but you. This is my pumpkin. Look, I don't want to put you on the spot, but you're my best source of DNA information. We won't discuss other things so you don't get caught up in the middle of things, but I need to know if you've had a DNA match." "Yes, Daddy, that's right," she sighed. "Amanda Anderson turned out to be my half-sister." "Mandy? Uncle George and Aunt Ginny's Mandy? Oh, holy shit." "I'm sorry, Daddy," she said quietly. "It's not your fault, Pumpkin. You don't need to apologize to me ever," I said, as calmly as I could. That meant that George Anderson, Uncle George to my kids, appeals court judge George Anderson to the rest of the world, was Marissa's biological father. Damn! This meant that my wife slept with her boss when he was an attorney at the law firm of Guihao and Associates. That meant at least 25 years ago, considering Marissa was 24 years old. Kaylee had been his administrator at the time. He'd left the firm to become a state judge a few years later, moving to the state capital before his career really took off. For her part, Kaylee did not pursue a relationship with Jake, preferring to stay at Guihao and eventually taking the position of office manager. But in the few years that George and Kaylee worked together, he and his wife Ginny became such good friends that our children still call them Uncle and Auntie, and their children call me and Kaylee the same. And a few times when I was away on a business trip, Kaylee and the kids would visit George and Ginny for a few days at their lake house. Oh crap! The kids even talked a few times about Aunt Ginny taking them here and there. Neither Uncle George nor Mom went with them, and I never even gave it a second thought. Damn it! I must have been distracted at that moment because I heard Marissa call out to me, Daddy? Daddy? I'm sorry, Pumpkin. I got lost in my thoughts. Thanks for your help, babe. Say hi to Drew. Wait a minute, Dad. What are you going to do? It was a legitimate question, but I didn't have a good answer, so I just told her the truth. I'm not sure, kid. Well, don't do anything incredibly stupid, Dad. A little foolishness is okay, but don't get arrested or anything. I hadn't thought about shooting Kaylee until that moment, but I had promised Marissa that I wouldn't be arrested, so I guess that ruled out the possibility of shooting. I don't break promises to my kids ever. Calming Marissa down about our relationship was my #1 task, and finding out who Kaylee's partner in crime was my second task. Task number 3 was to start divorce proceedings after I found a new lawyer, because my current lawyer belongs to the firm Kaylee works for. This, of course, was not to be discussed over the phone with Marissa. As I hung up, I sat back on the porch swing, letting the enormity of the situation wash over me. The weight of betrayal was heavy, but I knew I had to keep moving forward, step by step. Kaylee's deceit had cut deep, but my love for my children was unwavering, and I would do whatever it took to protect them. The next morning, I woke up with a newfound determination. I made a list of tasks and set about tackling them one by one. First, I contacted a few colleagues discreetly to get recommendations for a good divorce attorney. By midday, I had several promising leads. That afternoon, I decided to confront Kaylee. I couldn't keep living under the same roof without addressing the elephant in the room. As I walked into the house, I found her sitting at the kitchen table, her eyes red from crying. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady but firm. She looked up, her face a mixture of fear and sorrow. "I know," she whispered. I took a deep breath. I spoke to Marissa. I know about George. Kaylee's eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry, Alex. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake. I never wanted to hurt you." "A mistake that lasted over 2 decades, I replied, my voice tinged with bitterness. "You betrayed me, Kaylee. You betrayed our family." She broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. "I know, and I regret it every single day. Please, Alex, can we try to fix this for the sake of our family?" I shook my head. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again. But we need to think about the kids. They deserve to know the truth, and they deserve to see us handling this with dignity." We talked for hours, going over everything that had happened and how we would move forward. It was one of the hardest conversations of my life, but it was necessary. By the end of it, we agreed to a trial separation while we figured things out. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of emotions and decisions. I moved into a small apartment nearby and focused on my work and my children. Kaylee and I started therapy, both individually and together, to try to understand and heal from the past. Throughout it all, Marissa remained my rock. She supported me, reassured me, and reminded me of the love we shared. Her strength gave me hope, and her love kept me grounded. As the months went by, I began to find a new sense of normalcy. The pain was still there, but it was starting to fade. I was building a new life, one based on honesty and trust, and I was determined to come out stronger on the other side. Kaylee and I were still working through our issues, and while I didn't know what the future held for us, I knew that I would always have my children by my side. They were my anchor, my reason for pushing forward, and no betrayal could ever take that away from me. After I had a good sit-down with the lawyer, I would have to deal with the soon-to-be ex-Mrs. Clark Walters. It was chilly at home. When we were together, Kaylee chattered like a magpie. Nerves, I suppose. She seemed to try her hardest to make me happy, figuring it would lessen the repercussions when I found out. I don't know. But there was definitely distance between us, and she wasn't about to break the ice. About a week later, I met with one attorney, and when he found out that my wife worked as an office manager at Gui Hao, he got a very nervous look on his face. So I moved on to the next attorney on my list, a 20-something woman who just smiled when I mentioned that Kaylee was the office manager at Gui Hao. This was who I was looking for, someone who wouldn't be intimidated when one of the big Gui Hao attorneys acted as my wife's representative. I laid out what little I knew about the cheating scenario, starting, of course, with learning that my youngest child was not biologically mine and finding out that she was Judge Anderson's child. Court of Appeals Judge Anderson? My attorney, one Marie Robinette, asked. Same thing, I replied, watching her face to see if I needed to find another lawyer. It must be good, she said in response, and we started discussing financials. Since we both had good jobs, pensions, and benefits, Marie suggested that we split the joint property in half, keep our pensions, and sell the house. This would leave us both well off, although I would be in a slightly better position because I would have more income and a better pension. Unless you really want to crush her over infidelity, a child, or a general lack of respect, she quickly added, taking a moment to indicate that she might jump up on the conference table to try and right the wrongs done to me. We'll have our payback, of that I'm sure, but I don't want to hurt her financially, I replied. What about the judge? Are we going to prosecute him for anything? Because if so, it's going to be much more difficult and will increase your score considerably. The judge is my problem, and I'll deal with it as I see fit, I snapped back, perhaps too harshly. Got it, she replied. If she doesn't fight, it could be 6 months, Marie remarked. If she does fight, however, we could be talking more than a year. I don't have any dates set up yet, so take your time and do it right, I told her. The third task was behind us. Now it was time for the fourth, the showdown. I waited another week, just to see if Kaylee's head would explode in that time. Saturday night was our usual date night. Then we'd come home, watch a movie, and make love. But Saturday night sex was always special. We hadn't gone on a date in 2 weeks, and we hadn't had sex in the same amount of time because I just couldn't bring myself to do it after I found out about the affair and Marissa. Kaylee didn't even question it, another sign that she knew I was aware, but she was very good at pretending. However, there was an end to that. I took her out to a nice restaurant, one of her favorites. The ambiance was perfect, with soft lighting and a quiet corner where we could talk. Kaylee seemed a bit nervous, but tried to hide it with forced smiles and small talk. As we ate, I found myself studying her, wondering how many other secrets she might be hiding. After dinner, we took a walk by the river, something we hadn't done in a long time. The night air was crisp, and the stars were bright. It felt almost nostalgic, but there was a heaviness between us that couldn't be ignored. Alex, what's on your mind? She finally asked, unable to bear the silence any longer. I took a deep breath. Kaylee, we need to talk about us, about everything. Her eyes widened, and she looked down at her feet. I know, she whispered. When were you planning to tell me about George? I asked, my voice steady but filled with underlying anger. Tears welled up in her eyes. I never meant to hurt you. It was a mistake, a long time ago. I thought it was buried. But it wasn't, Kaylee. It came back to haunt us, and now Marissa is caught in the middle. She broke down, sobbing. I am so sorry, Alex. I was young and stupid. I didn't know how to fix it, so I just ignored it, but I never stopped loving you. I believe you loved me, Kaylee, but you also betrayed me, and that betrayal has consequences. We walked in silence for a few moments, the sound of her crying mingling with the gentle rush of the river. What happens now? She asked, her voice barely audible. I've spoken to a lawyer. We're going to split everything, sell the house, and move on with our lives. I don't want to drag this through the mud, but we need to be honest and respectful, especially for the kids. She nodded, wiping her tears. I understand. I deserve this, but please don't shut me out completely. We have a lot of history, and I hope we can still be civil. Civil, yes. Friends, maybe. But trust is something that's going to take a long time to rebuild, if ever. As we walked back to the car, I felt a strange sense of relief. The confrontation was over, and the path ahead was clear, even if it was filled with uncertainty. We drove home in silence, each lost in our thoughts. The movie that night was just background noise, and the bed felt colder than ever. But for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. The end of one chapter meant the beginning of another, and I was determined to write it on my own terms. Nice French restaurant. We shared a bottle of wine, and even had some great desserts. She was happier than I'd seen her in weeks. And when we got home, I carefully removed her coat, led her to the kitchen table, pulled out a chair for her, and said those famous words, "We need to talk." Kaylee sort of half smiled as I poured myself a Jack Daniels on the rocks and offered her something from the liquor cabinet, which she delicately declined. I set my drink on the table, looked her straight in the eye, and said, "The floor is all yours." That was a long time ago, Clark. George and I haven't slept together in about 20 years. Can't we just chalk it up as a mistake from a long time ago and leave it at that? I have to admit, I was glad she didn't go out of her way to say the DNA test was wrong, but to try to brush it off by saying it was so long ago, it didn't matter anymore. Really? So the last time you had sex together was about 20 years ago. When did you start having sex? How often? And why did you eventually stop? I need all of that. But first of all, I need to know if baby number 1 and baby number 2 are also his. No, Clark. Leo and Katie are yours. I didn't even sleep with George until about a year after Katie was born. Our affair lasted about 3 years at first, and then stopped when George decided to leave the firm and move up the judicial ladder. He waited about a year after we broke up to take his first judicial position because he wanted to make sure the background check would show he was clean. And after that, we only made love a few times at the lake house when Ginny innocently took all the kids out for an afternoon of fun. Ginny didn't know anything at the time either, but George eventually told her, and later the three of us had a peace meeting where both George and I promised her that there would be no more sex. Why didn't you ever tell me that and try to have a peaceful powwow with me? What am I, chopped liver? I asked sharply. Kaylee wiped her hands on her sleeves and replied, I knew I could never tell you. You would divorce me in a heartbeat, and I certainly didn't want that. I loved you, and I still do. You just apparently love George more, I said, starting and stopping at his command without giving me a second thought. I was your backup. No, Clark, I love you with all my heart, she pleaded. No, you loved him with all your heart. You loved him so much that you gave him up so he could realize his career dream while knowing I was your backup plan. You may have loved me to some degree, but you knew I goddamn worshipped the ground you walk on and counted on that and our family to help you through his loss. Kaylee dropped her eyes to her knees. The truth hurt, and I knew I'd hit the mark. What about Marissa? Obviously, he was doing bare hands with you, and you should have known where that could lead, and did. I just figured that since you both had brown hair, brown eyes, and fair skin, no one would ever guess whose baby it was. And I knew you'd have no reason to think she wasn't yours, so when she turned out to look so much like me, you just hoped I'd never figure it out. Am I right? Kaylee nodded, her tears flowing freely now. Yes, Clark, I was scared and selfish. I thought I could keep it all hidden and that it would never come back to haunt us. I knew how much you loved me, and I used that to keep you in the dark. I know it's unforgivable, and I'm so sorry. I took a deep breath, trying to process everything. You know, Kaylee, love isn't just about passion and romance. It's about trust and respect, and you've shattered both. I don't know if I can ever get past this. She sobbed harder, her body shaking with the force of her emotions. Please, Clark, give me a chance to make it right. I'll do anything. I stood up, feeling the weight of the world on my shoulders. We'll see, Kaylee. For now, we need some space. I need to think, and you need to figure out what you really want. We'll talk more later. I walked out of the kitchen, leaving her crying at the table. The night air was cold as I stepped outside, but it felt refreshing, almost cleansing. The road ahead was uncertain, but I knew one thing for sure. The life I once knew was over. It was time to start a new chapter, and I was determined to write it on my own terms. As I stood there, staring up at the stars, I felt a strange sense of hope. Yes, the betrayal hurt deeply, but it also opened my eyes to the possibilities of a future free from lies. And with that thought, I turned back towards the house, ready to face whatever came next with a newfound strength and determination. Like me anyway, I didn't have to worry about it until you sent her that damn DNA test. Honestly, I didn't know anything before that. So it's my fault? I asked incredulously. No. George and I discussed the possibility, but I told him he needn't worry since you two look alike. For all I know, he didn't know either, but I'm sure Mandy has already brought him up to speed. I haven't heard from him in at least a couple years, not since they were at Marissa and Drew's wedding 2 years ago. No matter who knows what, Marissa is still mine, and that's what I told her. I'm on the birth certificate. I raised her. I love her. She's mine. George better not think about it, and if he calls, you better tell him that. And by the way, I'm going to have the other 2 children DNA tested as soon as possible. I need to know that for my own peace of mind. Clark, hissed Kaylee, I told you they were yours. And you expect me to trust you? Why? I snapped back. Like everything else, Kaylee was completely stunned by my newfound distrust. What the hell did she expect? But I know she was also greatly disturbed that I would tell the other 2 kids about her infidelity. No one wants to look like a slut in front of their own children. So how often have you 2 been doing this, and where? I pressed on. Finish the story, at least for me. We didn't plan it, Clark. It just happened that way. We spent so much time together working, and then we became friends, and it grew into something more. He was kind, considerate, witty, funny, passionate. You know the man. And we connected on a deeper level. But because we had spouses we both loved, we kept things to a minimum and moved our meeting places, usually out of town. No, we never met here or at his house. That would have been wrong on several levels. But that didn't stop the 2 of you from shagging a few times at the lake house after the affair supposedly ended while Ginny was out with the kids, I pondered aloud. No, we haven't, she practically whispered to me. But I swear to you, we haven't had intimacy since. And Ginny knows about all of this and has forgiven you both? I asked, shaking my head in bewilderment. Yes, I told you. I don't think I can, I whispered, and there was undisguised excitement in my voice. We know what we did was wrong, Clark, but it's been over for 20 years, and you never suffered through it while it was all happening, so can't we just go back to where we were a few weeks ago? You were my loving husband. I was your loving wife. Nothing has to change. But things have already changed, Kaylee, I said. I've spent the better part of 3 weeks wondering what I did wrong that you fell in love with another man, and wondering if I could ever fully trust you again, let alone trust you enough to stay married to you. Then when I gave you my heart completely, and you put it in your pocket and took it out when it suited you. It wasn't supposed to be a marriage of convenience. It was supposed to be a marriage of total commitment, of love. At this point, Kaylee started crying. Tears streamed down her face, her shoulders shaking with sobs that echoed through the kitchen. Clark, please, she choked out between sobs. I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen. I was foolish and selfish, and now I'm paying the price. I stood there, feeling a strange mix of anger, pity, and a sense of finality. The woman I had loved for over 3 decades was sitting before me, broken and remorseful, but the damage was done. The betrayal was too deep, and the trust was shattered. I don't know if I can ever forgive you, Kaylee, I said softly. And I don't know if I can ever trust you again. We can't just sweep this under the rug and pretend it never happened. It's a wound that won't heal overnight, if it ever does. She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen from crying. What do we do now? She whispered. We take it one step at a time, I replied. We need to figure out what's best for us and for the kids. This isn't something we can rush. We need time to think, to process, and to decide what our future holds. With that, I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Kaylee alone with her thoughts and her regrets. As I stepped outside into the cool night air, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was a path I was determined to walk with my head held high. I had faced the truth, and now it was time to move forward, whatever that might mean. I hate it when she does that, and I usually try to calm her down, but this time was different. I went into the family room and turned on the TV, leaving her at the kitchen table. We slept in the same bed that night, but for the first time in a while, we didn't snuggle against each other. I moved as far away from her as I could on the double bed and didn't let her slide into me when she climbed in. Her face reflected shock and pain, but I didn't care. Kaylee made us a nice breakfast Sunday morning, and while we were eating, I brought up the subject of divorce. The affair was over 20 years ago. You didn't even know about it, for God's sake. It's over. Now let's just move on, she practically yelled at me. A mistake remains a mistake, no matter how long ago it was, I shouted back at her. You deceived me. You lied to me. You cheated on me and violated my trust. These are not temporary problems. I got up from the table, leaving half my plate of food behind, and went outside to mow the lawn. That was the last conversation I had with Kaylee until Wednesday afternoon when she informed me that Ginny Anderson would be joining us next weekend. Needless to say, I wasn't thrilled, but Ginny was an old, dear friend and had endured the same cheating that I had, so I figured I should have a chat with her. Ginny showed up Friday night at 6 o'clock, having traveled 2 hours from her house. She hadn't brought George with her. Kaylee made stuffed flank steak with mashed potatoes, and I brought a couple of bottles of Merlot to go along with it. Conversation was light and friendly during dinner, and then we retired to the family room with glasses of wine to, I assumed, get down to the main event. Ginny began to talk about the affair as a historical subject, very sterile and calm, but as she spoke further, her emotions grew stronger and tears came to her and Kaylee's eyes. When George told me about the affair, I assumed it was over years ago, and he promised me it wouldn't happen again, Ginny said. I'll admit I was devastated at first, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that since it was over before I even knew about it, I guess I wasn't hurt too badly. And since I knew that Kaylee wasn't some gold digger, I realized how it could have happened. George's personality is kind of addictive, isn't it? Although I didn't know about Marissa until a few weeks ago when everyone found out about it, I guess. I'm really sorry about that, Clark. Ginny never mentioned the few times Kaylee and George met after the main affair ended at the Andersons' lake house. I wondered if they had told her about it. I didn't bother to inquire, but I figured George must be a great lawyer because Ginny was almost apologizing for George having an affair instead of being upset with him. Unfortunately for Kaylee, I'm not as settled as Ginny and not as enthralled by her oratory, so I wasn't willing to give Kaylee and George a pass, like Ginny, even if their romance had been going on for 20 years. I just think back to what my life would be like if I left him and how things would be different for me and the girls, she continued. They say you should always think about whether your life would be better or worse after a decision like that. And for me, I realized that staying with George was better for all of us. I sat there, listening to Ginny rationalize her decision, and couldn't help but feel a mix of admiration and pity for her. She had managed to find a way to live with the betrayal and move forward. But for me, it wasn't that simple. The wound was too fresh, too deep, and I couldn't see a way to just move on as if nothing had happened. I understand why you stayed, Ginny, I said finally, my voice calm but firm. But for me, it's not just about the affair. It's about the lies, the deceit, and the complete lack of respect for our marriage. I don't know if I can ever forgive that, let alone forget it. Kaylee's tears flowed freely now, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Ginny reached out to comfort her, but Kaylee pulled away, looking at me with a mixture of desperation and sorrow. "Clark, please," she whispered. "I know I made a terrible mistake, but can't we find a way to move past this? Can't we rebuild what we had?" I took a deep breath, trying to keep my emotions in check. "I don't know, Kaylee. Right now I need time. Time to think, time to heal, and time to decide what's best for me. This isn't something that can be fixed overnight." The room fell silent, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. Ginny looked at both of us, her eyes filled with empathy and understanding. "I think it's best if I go," she said softly. "You two need to work through this on your own." She stood up, giving Kaylee a reassuring hug before turning to me. "Clark, if you ever need to talk, I'm here for you." I nodded, appreciating the offer, but knowing that this was something I had to handle myself. As Ginny left, I felt a sense of relief mixed with the weight of the decisions ahead. That night, Kaylee and I slept in the same bed again, but the distance between us felt like an ocean. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts and questions. How did we get here? Could we ever find our way back? As the first light of dawn broke through the curtains, I knew one thing for certain. The road ahead was uncertain, but I was determined to navigate it with honesty and integrity. Whether that meant rebuilding our marriage or moving on alone, I was ready to face the future head on. House. I needed some fresh air, a chance to clear my head from the whirlwind of emotions that were threatening to overwhelm me. Jeannie followed me out to the porch, her face etched with concern. Clark, I understand that this is incredibly painful, but think about the life you've built together, the family you have. Is it worth throwing all that away for something that's in the past? I took a deep breath, the crisp evening air filling my lungs. Jeannie, it's not just about the affair. It's about the betrayal, the lies, the trust that's been shattered. It's about waking up every day knowing that the person you thought you knew has been hiding something so significant from you for so long. She nodded, her expression softening. I get that. I do. But sometimes holding on to that anger and pain only hurts you more. If there's a chance to rebuild, to find a new way forward, isn't it worth considering? I looked out into the darkening sky, the stars beginning to peek through. I don't know if I have it in me, Jeannie. I don't know if I can ever look at Kaylee the same way again. Every time I see her, all I can think about is her with Jake, and it tears me apart. Jeannie placed a hand on my arm, a gesture of comfort. You need to take the time you need to heal, Clark. No one is saying you have to make a decision right now. Just know that forgiveness is not about forgetting or excusing what happened. It's about freeing yourself from the burden of anger and pain. I sighed, feeling the weight of her words. Maybe you're right. Maybe I need to find a way to let go of the anger, if not for Kaylee's sake, then for my own. She smiled gently. That's a start, Clark. Take it one day at a time. I nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope amidst the turmoil. Thanks, Jeannie. I appreciate you being here. As I walked back into the house, I found Kaylee waiting for me in the kitchen. She looked up, her eyes red from crying. Clark, I know I can't undo what I've done, but I want to try and make things right. I want to fight for us, for our marriage. I looked at her, the woman I'd loved for so long, and felt a pang of sadness. Kaylee, I need time. I need to figure out if I can move past this, if we can rebuild the trust that's been broken. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I'll wait as long as it takes. Just please don't give up on us. I didn't have the heart to respond. I turned and headed upstairs, needing the solitude of our bedroom to process everything. The road ahead was uncertain, but I knew one thing. I couldn't keep living in the past. It was time to look towards the future, whatever it might hold. The following morning, I woke up feeling a little more at peace. The conversations with Jeannie and Kaylee had given me a lot to think about. I decided to take a long walk, hoping that some fresh air and exercise would help clear my mind. As I walked through the quiet streets of our neighborhood, I reflected on everything that had happened over the past few weeks. When I returned home, I found Kaylee sitting on the porch, a cup of coffee in her hands. She looked up as I approached, a tentative smile on her face. Morning, Clark. Morning, I replied, sitting down beside her. I've been thinking a lot about what Jeannie said last night. Kaylee nodded, her eyes searching mine. And I think she's right. We can't change the past, but we can try to find a way to move forward. It's not going to be easy, and it's going to take a lot of work. But I'm willing to try if you are. She reached out and took my hand, squeezing it tightly. I'm willing to do whatever it takes, Clark. I love you, and I want to make this work. I looked into her eyes, seeing the sincerity and regret there. All right, Kaylee, let's take it one day at a time and see where it leads us. As we sat there on the porch, holding hands and watching the world wake up around us, I felt a tentative sense of hope. The road ahead was still uncertain, but at least we were walking it together. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. Passing Kaylee in the hallway. She could clearly see from the look on my face and my stiff demeanor that I was resolute in my decision. Saturday night's dinner was painfully silent. The women tried to make small talk, their attempts falling flat. I wasn't in the mood for chit-chat. I barely uttered 3 words throughout the entire meal. As soon as we finished, I muttered a quick thank you, grabbed my jacket, and announced that I was heading to Malone's, my go-to spot for a quiet drink. Upon arriving at Malone's, I noticed Ronnie, the bar owner, chatting animatedly with a group of regulars in the far corner. Instead of my usual spot at the bar, I chose a secluded table. I felt utterly miserable, and I was certain my face reflected that. Marnie, the bartender, approached me with my usual, a crown black on the rocks, and remarked that I looked like I'd lost my best friend. It's more than that, I replied with a hollow laugh. Just my marriage falling apart. Marnie exchanged a concerned look with Ronnie, who promptly excused herself from her conversation and made her way over to my table. Ronnie, with her fiery red hair and an air of no nonsense, plopped down across from me. "All right, Superman, spill it," she demanded. Ronnie called me Superman because my name reminded her of Clark Kent. She often joked that while I was a mild-mannered engineer by day, she wouldn't want to see me angry. Moose, her husband, was the bar's cook and resident enforcer, a former Marine sergeant who looked every bit the part at 6'3" and nearly 300 pounds. Malone's was usually a peaceful place, but on the rare occasion things got out of hand, Moose was more than capable of restoring order. "Kaylee and I are over," I began, feeling a strange sense of relief at finally saying it out loud. "I found out she had an affair with her boss 20 years ago. Not just a one-time mistake, but a 4-year-long relationship. And Marissa isn't even mine. She's his." Ronnie's eyes widened in shock, but she remained silent, letting me continue. "Kaylee thinks that because it happened so long ago and I didn't know about it at the time, I should just get over it and move on. She claims she loves me, always has, and that she doesn't want a divorce. But how can I just pretend everything's okay? How do I get past this?" Ronnie reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Clark, I can't imagine how you're feeling right now. That's a hell of a lot to process. But you need to take it one step at a time. Figure out what you want, not what Kaylee wants or what anyone else thinks you should do." I nodded, appreciating her straightforward advice. "It's just hard, you know? I thought we had a good marriage. I thought I knew her. Sometimes people do things we can't understand," Ronnie said softly. "That doesn't mean you have to accept it or forgive it if you don't want to. It's your life, Clark. You have to decide what's best for you." We talked for a while longer, Ronnie listening patiently as I unloaded the burden I'd been carrying. By the time I left Malone's, I felt a little lighter, a little more certain of the path I needed to take. When I got home, Kaylee was waiting up for me. She looked anxious, her eyes red from crying. "Did you have a good talk with Ronnie?" she asked hesitantly. "Yeah, I did," I replied, my tone neutral. "I'm glad," she said softly. "Clark, I know I've hurt you deeply, and I can't undo the past, but I want to try and make things right if you'll let me." I sighed, feeling the weight of her words. "Kaylee, I need time. This isn't something I can just get over. I need to figure out if I can ever trust you again, if I can move past this." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I understand. I'll give you all the time you need." As I turned to head upstairs, I paused. "Kaylee, I'm not making any promises. I'm not sure where this will lead, but I'm willing to try and see if we can rebuild what's been broken." Her face lit up with a glimmer of hope. "That's all I can ask for, Clark. Thank you." I went to bed that night feeling a mix of emotions, anger, hurt, but also a faint sense of hope. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like there might be a way forward. "That little cheating bitch," exclaimed Ronnie, her face flushed with anger. "How dare she? You're not just going to take it and let her stay, are you? If that happened to me and Moose, he'd have my ass up against the wall and the guy's hide tacked up next to it." Hearing Ronnie's vehement support was reassuring. I valued her sensible and unbiased view on things, and knowing she agreed with me solidified my stance. "Look, Superman, this is about respect as much as anything else. I love Kaylee, but her deception was not born out of love, and certainly not out of respect. How could she let you think of someone else's child as your own all these years?" I explained Marissa's situation to Ronnie, noting that while Kaylee didn't know for sure, she had refused to test the baby, a convenient way of saying she didn't want to know. Ronnie's eyes narrowed in thought. "Did she ever apologize for cheating or just for hurting you?" "Damn it, you're right," I admitted, frustrated. "She never apologized for cheating. I don't even think she truly apologized for hurting me. The only thing she seems to regret is that I found out." Ronnie leaned in, her voice low but firm. "I can't tell you what to do, Superman, but I think Kaylee's actions have already told you what you need to do. I'm sorry, Clark. Tonight's Corona is on me and Moose. The rest of the bottle is yours, and we'll call you a cab at the end of the night. Hand over your keys." I did as I was told, grateful for her support. The cab driver delivered me home around 2 in the morning. Kaylee met me at the door and guided me up to our bedroom. I fell into bed fully dressed, and Kaylee gently removed my shoes and socks before I passed out. Late Wednesday night, I received a call from my son while at the office. He wanted to discuss the situation with Kaylee, clearly having been influenced by her. "Dad, divorcing Mom would be the dumbest thing you've done since you wore that leisure suit in the 70s, he joked, trying to lighten the mood. "Seriously, Dad, divorce her for something she did 20 years ago? You only found out a few weeks ago, and just before that, you were saying how much you loved her and wanted to spend the rest of your life with her. Now you're ready to throw it all away because of a mistake? Really, Dad?" "First of all, Leo," I replied, my tone cold and measured, "a mistake is what she did the first few times she slept with him. After a few months, it was a decision, not a mistake. What would you do if you found out Linda was cheating on you? Probably rip her head off." "But you didn't catch her," Leo countered. "It's been over for 20 years. The physical act was over, but the deception, the lack of respect, that continued," I retorted. "Leo, I thought you were smart enough to stay out of this and not take sides, but you've stepped into a place no child should be, between your parents. And for what? I'm not going to change my mind. I'm the injured party here, and I need to do what's best for me," I said, my voice firm and unyielding. Leo sighed, realizing the futility of his argument. "I just want you to be happy, Dad. And I want that too, Leo. But right now, this is what I need to do to find some peace," I replied, ending the call. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of my decision, but knowing it was the right one. "And you're pissing me off." I put that woman on a pedestal. I idolized her, and she knew it. She was never going to tell me that. And if it hadn't been for the accident, I would have gone to my grave worshiping her. She just used me as a second choice when the man she loved the most didn't want to marry her. Do I feel used, Sonny? I sure do. "Dad, aren't you being overdramatic?" Leo's voice dripped with exasperation. I didn't even bother replying before I hung up the phone. When I walked through the door around 6 that evening, Kaylee was already in the kitchen, preparing a meal that smelled fantastic. The delicious aroma filled the house, but I wasn't in the mood for it. She glanced up, her expression hopeful, but it faded when I told her, "I'm not hungry." I poured myself a generous glass of Jack Daniels, turned on the TV, and sank into my favorite chair. Kaylee followed me into the living room, a worried look on her face. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Same shit, different day," I replied, my voice tinged with bitterness. "My wife cheats on me for 4 years, has a kid with another guy, and now my kids are telling me I'm the bad guy here. Do me a favor. Call Kathy tonight and tell her not to call me tomorrow if she doesn't want to be hung up on like Leo." Kaylee's eyes lowered, filled with guilt and sorrow. "You'd think after 31 years she'd know not to piss me off on your behalf," I added, my voice rising. "What makes you think the divorce won't go through? Not only did you cheat on me for 4 years with another man and have a child with him, but you replaced me in your heart with him. You can sit here and tell me that you weren't in love with him, and that if he had asked you to divorce me and marry him, you wouldn't have done it. But here's the thing. You may love me, but you're not in love with me. You're in love with him. I'm just a solid backup plan because you've always known that my heart belongs to you, and I'd do anything for you just to have you as mine. You cheated on me, you lied to me, you disrespected me, and now you have the nerve to try to turn our children against me. That was the last straw, Trace." I paused, letting my words sink in. Kaylee's tears flowed freely now, and she rose from her chair, looking utterly defeated. "But no, I won't be cruel to you, and especially not to Ginny, and I won't ruin George's wonderful career as a clean-cut judge. I'll file a statement of irreconcilable differences, and we can each keep our retirement accounts and split the house and everything else in half." Her sobs grew louder, and as she walked away, I threw one last thing at her. "You never told me you regretted cheating. Probably because you don't regret it, which is at least honest. The only thing you regret is that I found out, isn't it?" I spent the rest of the night curled up with my bottle of Jack, drowning in my thoughts and sorrows. The next day, I called my attorney and told her to get the divorce papers ready as soon as possible. She said I could review them the following Tuesday, she would have them ready by Wednesday, and Kaylee could be served on Thursday. I told her to bring her server to my house on Friday night. I wanted to be there when she was served. Then I called Judge George Anderson's office and set up a meeting for the following week. It was time to confront the man who had turned my life upside down. Told his receptionist that I needed him to call me back on an important matter. He knew exactly why I was calling, and I knew he would return my call as soon as possible. When George called me back about 2 hours later, he sounded a little anxious. Yes, he knew exactly why I was reaching out, and though he preferred not to discuss it in his office, I agreed. We decided I'd visit his house the following Saturday at 10 a.m. By then, Kaylee would have been served the divorce papers, although I'm sure George would be well informed about that long before my 2-hour drive to his opulent home. Over dinner at Malone's that Saturday night, Kaylee mentioned that Ginny had called her to inform her about my scheduled meeting with George. She asked if I wanted her to come along for the trip. "This isn't small talk, Kaylee," I said firmly. "George and I have something to discuss, and you don't need to be there. Remember, he's an appellate court judge with an impeccable reputation and might even be shortlisted for a Supreme Court judgeship. If you pull any stunts, you could get arrested, and besides, you promised you wouldn't do anything to jeopardize his career. Of course, you'll prefer him over me again, but don't worry, I intend to keep my promise. I won't do anything that might get him dropped from the short list of potential Supreme Court justices. God forbid. The show must go on," I said, my voice laced with sarcasm. After filling in the old man at the office about what was going on in my life, I took a couple of personal hours to meet with my attorney to finalize the divorce papers. I gave her the green light. Just as I was about to leave, she asked if I had any plans for Judge George. "Why would you worry about that?" I asked, winking at her. "Because I'm still handling some criminal cases, and I thought you might need a good lawyer," she replied. "You engineers don't seem to get too emotional about a lot of things, but I know you're pretty tight-lipped, and your methodical approach to things scares me." She handed me her business card, and I walked out of the office. The next 3 days flew by quickly. We had a major project at the office, which allowed me to focus on something other than my personal life. The old man even remarked how impressed he was with my focus, despite all the turmoil. I told him I was glad that at least something was going right. But before I left on Friday, I informed him about Kaylee being served and my upcoming confrontation with George. I warned him that if things went south, I might be in jail on Monday. He assured me he'd have my back and my bail money ready. We parted with a handshake. I came home to the enticing aroma of yet another wonderful meal that Kaylee was cooking. She had been going out of her way lately to showcase her many talents, trying to get me to notice her. She really was a fantastic cook. I almost felt guilty because I knew what was coming after dinner. We ate mostly in silence, as we had for the past few weeks, the unspoken tension hanging heavy in the air. The inevitable confrontation was looming, and despite the delicious meal and Kaylee's efforts, nothing could distract me from the storm that was about to break. Though I didn't fail to tell her how wonderful the meal was. After all, I'm not an ungrateful bastard. We put the dishes away together, moving in a synchronized dance of domesticity that once felt natural, but now felt forced. Just as we were about to settle into the family room for an evening of television, the doorbell rang. It was almost 7 o'clock. I knew it wasn't for me, so I didn't budge. Kaylee gave me a cheerful look, then walked to the door and opened it. Standing on the porch was a well-dressed young man holding a manila envelope. "Are you Kaylee Walters?" he asked. When she nodded, he handed her the envelope and said, "You've been served." Without another word, he turned on his heel and walked away. Kaylee stood frozen, the envelope dangling from her fingers. Her shoulders began to shake, and I knew she was crying. I walked past her, closed the front door, and gently guided her to the kitchen table. She looked utterly shattered, even though I had warned her this moment was coming. We sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, but was probably no more than 5 minutes. Finally, she muttered, "You bastard," and ran upstairs to our bedroom. I didn't follow her. The hard part was done. For the first time since we'd been married, I didn't sleep in the same bed as Kaylee that night. Instead, I went to the guest bedroom and lay there, staring at the ceiling, wrestling with my thoughts. I had just broken with the woman I once considered the light of my life, my soulmate, my everything. Despite everything that had transpired, we had still been sharing the same bed. Maybe it was a final attempt to cling to the remnants of our life together. But now it was over, at least in my mind. The next morning, I got up, took a shower, and quietly made my way to the bedroom to gather my clothes, trying my hardest not to wake Kaylee. I didn't check to see if she was asleep. I just grabbed what I needed and left. I dressed in my usual attire, a collared shirt, decent Levi's jeans, and the custom-made cowboy boots I had gotten when we visited our son in Dallas. I left the house a little earlier than necessary to ensure I wouldn't be late for my meeting with George. Arriving early, I killed some time at a nearby cafe, sipping on coffee and preparing myself for what was to come. At 10 sharp, I stood on the porch of George and Ginny's house and rang the bell. Ginny, looking as lovely as ever, but visibly nervous, opened the door. "I'm sorry it ended this way," I said as she leaned in to hug me. She didn't reply, just took my hand and led me to the room where George had his memorabilia and pictures displayed. George was sitting in his favorite chair, but he stood up when we entered. "Hey, Clark," he said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "Hey, Jake," I replied. Ginny, looking very scared, excused herself from the room. George and I stood about 6 feet apart, staring at each other. Once upon a time, I had considered this man an older brother. He was 2 years older than me, and about the same height. The tension in the room was palpable, and the weight of our shared history hung heavy in the air. But the soft life of the last 20 years had added about 30 more pounds, about 20 on his round belly. We shared hopes and dreams with each other, had fun together, fished together, hunted together. I was proud to call him my friend, and proud of where his career as a judge had taken him. Now, standing in front of me and appraising me with his gaze, he was no longer a friend but an enemy. The man who had stolen my wife's love, impregnated her with his child, and ruined my life. Suddenly I was seized with rage. "You get to keep my wife's heart, you bastard!" I yelled at him. "You also get to keep your squeaky image, because I promised Kaylee I wouldn't tell anyone about this, and I don't break promises to that woman. But you won't keep your balls." At this point, I took a long, quick step forward with my left foot and then planted my right foot and drove it forward and upward, aiming for a 50-yard goal, the target of which was his aforementioned testicles. George reacted even slower than I had anticipated, and my metal-tipped boot hit the target accurately and precisely. I felt his balls clench as I thrust my foot as high as I could, and then heard him yelp like a wounded animal. He collapsed to the floor, holding his gonads with his hands and squealing like a hunted pig. At that moment, Ginny ran into the room, saw her husband on the floor, and rushed to him. He continued to scream in agony, and there was nothing she could do to calm him. She looked at me in fear. I pulled my cell phone out of my pocket and dialed 911. "There's been an accident at Judge George Anderson's house," I said. "We need an ambulance." I turned on my heels and headed for the door, but no sooner had I reached it than Ginny grabbed my right arm. I thought I was going to have to hit the woman, but instead of hysteria and anger, there was a calm expression on her face. She hugged me tightly and whispered, "Thank you. We know what we have to do." I hugged her back, walked out of the house, got in my car, and drove home, knowing the cops wouldn't come after me. Ginny understood and would explain it to her husband sometime in the future when he could think straight. The ride home brought me relief, or maybe it was a kick in the balls. I don't know, but after months of daily heartbreak, I felt free. Funny thing is, once I finally realized Kaylee's betrayal, her grip on my heart loosened, and I was able to think clearly enough to do what was right for me. It may not have been right for everyone, but sometimes you just have to take care of yourself. That's what everyone else has done for the past 20 years, so why shouldn't I do the same? Yes, I knew that some part of me would always love Kaylee, but I wasn't going to waste any more time researching this novel. It wasn't my fault, and it wasn't my choice. It was time to move on. When I got home, I went down to the basement, grabbed a couple of suitcases, and headed for our bedroom. I passed Kaylee sitting in the family room, and she followed me into the bedroom. "So that's it then?" she asked, her voice trembling. Yes, Kaylee, that's it, I said, opening the closet and starting to pack my clothes. I'm done. She stood there for a moment, watching me pack. Clark, please, can't we talk about this? Can't we work something out? Her voice was filled with desperation, but I could hear the underlying resignation. I turned to look at her, feeling a mixture of sadness and resolve. Kaylee, we've talked enough. You've had 20 years to come clean, and you chose to hide the truth. I've made my decision. I need to move on with my life, and so do you. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't say anything else. She just nodded, accepting the reality of our situation. I continued packing, and within an hour, I had everything I needed. As I wheeled my suitcases out of the bedroom, Kaylee followed me to the front door. Where will you go? She asked softly. I'll figure it out, I replied, but wherever I go, it will be a fresh start. Goodbye, Kaylee. She watched me leave, standing in the doorway as I walked to my car and loaded my bags. I drove away, feeling a sense of liberation mixed with the pain of leaving behind the life I had known for so long. The future was uncertain, but I knew one thing for sure. I was finally free from the lies and betrayal that had haunted me for 2 decades. It was time to rebuild my life, one step at a time. That's it. 31 years and now it's over? Kaylee, I'm sorry you're so wrapped up that you can't see how you deceived me, how you stole 24 years of my love with your deception. You can't see that, and you probably never will. But I've gotten over it, and I don't hate you. I don't even hate Jake, though that poor bastard probably thinks I do now. I'll reconcile with Leo and Kathy sometime in the future. You should make up with Marissa as soon as possible. Poor girl's a mess. Sign the papers, Kaylee, and let's get this business over with. I'll have the rest of my stuff out of here in the next few days. I don't think we need to talk anymore. If you have anything to say to me, I've put my lawyer's business card on the kitchen table. She stood there in shock, tears streaming down her face, but there were no words. I picked up the suitcases, went downstairs, and put them in the trunk of my car. I went back into the house, gathered up the remaining items that were important to me, and left. 31 years, just like that. I lied. Apparently, George was able to save one of his testicles after all. It took major surgery and months of pain, but they were able to save one. I found out about it from Marissa, who had been contacted by Ginny looking for me. Ginny didn't have my phone number, and no one else in the family wanted to tell me. In fact, no one else in the family is still talking to me now, 8 months later. But I've made my peace with it. According to the official story, Judge George fell on the corner of his ornate office desk, hit himself hard, and then did it again, falling to the floor. The press called it a domestic accident to be sensitive and did not report that the blow was to the genital area. He got a lot of sympathetic press. I guess that won't stop him from getting on the Supreme Court shortlist. Kaylee signed the divorce papers within a week, and the divorce was finalized last week. The house will be auctioned off. Kaylee hasn't tried to call me since I left. Leo and Kathy haven't called either. It looks like I won't be invited to the family Christmas dinner, wherever it's being held. The old man is handing over the company to me from the new year, as he himself is retiring. Under the terms of the deal, I have to run the company for 7 years before I can retire a rich man with a very golden parachute. Then he'll find someone to buy the company, and I'll get 10% of that deal too. I've started going out and dating. After being married forever, it's taking me a while to remember exactly how to do that. However, word of the divorce spread quickly, and several of our divorced friends called to inquire about my interest. Moreover, 2 or 3 of Kaylee's divorced friends called too, expressing their surprise that she could let me go at all. I have to admit, it felt good for my ego. I have a good life ahead of me, with challenges both professionally and personally. I am working on finding new hobbies in my spare time away from my professional endeavors. One hobby I have given up is genealogy. I used to do it obsessively, but now I see it as a catalyst for the unraveling of my life as I knew it. Perhaps someday I'll pick it up again, but for now, I need to focus on the present and building a future free from the shadows of deception. Looking back, I realize that sometimes you have to go through the worst to find the best in life. Kaylee's betrayal was a painful chapter, but it was just that, a chapter. I've closed that book and am ready to write new, happier ones. With every step forward, I leave behind the weight of the past and embrace the promise of tomorrow.